Yeah, I'd love to see it, but thank you all for coming again. Today it's going to be about Saint Teresa of Avila, another true reformer, great reformer. So we'll just start with the opening prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. O my God, source of all mercy, I acknowledge your sovereign power. While recalling the wasted years that are past, I believe that you, Lord, can in an instant turn this loss to gain. Miserable as I am, yet I firmly believe that you can do all things. Please restore to me the time lost, giving me your grace, both now and in the future, that I may appear before you in wedding garments. Amen. And just before we start, one of the things I love most about Teresa is that story that I recount where she's very earnest and she's trying to do all these things to serve and please the Lord, and just one trial or tribulation after another. And she uttered this after she fell off a horse, saying, God is saying like, oh, you're one of my friends, and blah blah blah. Keep moving forward, and then he said, if this is how you treat your friends, no wonder you have so few. Which is I love because she's using humor, she's using honesty, and she's also admitting that it's not easy to have this zeal for Christ, to follow him faithfully, and so many obstacles are put in your way. And so she was kind of angry, but did it with humor. And I just think it's a very human and something that I think anybody can relate to. It doesn't, mean you have to take everything that comes your way without complaining. But her complaint is a form of a prayer. But anyway, we'll start the video presentation, and then we'll have our discussion. Turn it up.
Today we're going to meet a mystic who is also a reformer, Theresa of Avila. just this sort of life with them, as we think about what they would do in the situations we find ourselves in, and we pray to them for their intercessory help. Well, of all the saints that we're meeting, Theresa of Avila is the one who perhaps is the best candidate for being an old friend. Just consider that it was Theresa of Avila whom the little flower, Theresa of Lisieux, chose as her patroness. And then also, Saint Mother Teresa bears her name. She's a kind of mother and grandmother to the saints. And the marvelous thing about Theresa of Avila is that she left us an autobiography so that we can enter into her life and really understand how she would approach the troubles that beset us. Let's get to know her better. Theresa of Avila was a child of privilege. She came from a noble family. Both of her parents had wealthy ancestors, and she belonged to a part of the town of Avila that was accustomed to a life of comfort and ease. She and her brothers liked to imagine themselves as champions within the pantheon of Spain's great heroes stretching back through the centuries. El Cid, Pelayo, San Fernando. These were the heroes who had defended Spain against the Moors and won the country back. At one point in her childhood, she even wrote her own romantic novel. She was a lively girl. She was also graced by God with beauty and tremendous intelligence. She was attractive to all who knew her and, to some degree, captivating. There was really no doubt that she would become a leader. The question is just where she would lead people. As a young girl, she lost her mother. Her father, who had many children, wasn't quite sure what to do with her, and so sent her off to a convent school. Here, she became acquainted with the ways of prayer and started to think about God. But she also became very seriously ill for the first of many times in her life, and needed to go away from the convent school to convalesce for a long period of time. Part of that convalescence was at the home of an uncle of hers, Don Pedro. Don Pedro himself was a very devout man. He introduced her to spiritual writing. You see, his eyesight was failing, and he needed this girl to actually read aloud to him so that he could appreciate the wisdom of the saints. She read to him from St. Jerome's letters, for instance. I think we can see the seed of her vocation crystallizing in her. Well, she goes back home to help her father deal with her little siblings, but she's thinking about a life dedicated to God. Her father doesn't like the idea, so in fact, Theresa, with the help of one of her brothers, steals out of the house in the early hours of the morning and flees to the Carmelite convent nearby in Avila. Her father is perplexed and angry. He realizes he has a very special daughter here, and by the grace of God, it didn't take him very many hours to come to terms with the reality of his daughter's vocation. He agreed to pay the convent the needed dowry, and in 1535, Theresa became a nun of the Convent of the Incarnation. The Convent of the Incarnation in Avila would be to us a very foreign place. There were 300 women living a cloistered religious life together there. What an astonishing number of nuns under one roof. It bears asking, how could this be? What's happening in Spain in the 16th century is such that in a small town of Avila at most 10,000 people, there's a convent of 300 nuns. Well, asking this question takes us right to the heart of the spiritual drama of Theresa of Avila's life. Because you see, in Spain, they loved the contemplative life. They understood it for what it was, a life dedicated to God. The Spaniards had fought hard for their Catholic faith over those 8 centuries when they reconquered the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors. And there was a fierce, fierce love for prayer. But the strength of Spain was also, in an odd way, He would give Theresa ecstatic moments of union with himself, visions, and he spoke to her. And she found herself drawn to prayer for great long periods of time. In fact, she didn't even know how long she was praying. She would wander in and out of moments of ecstasy that she could not control. And her sisters, looking for her, would find her wants to leave the convent because it isn't good enough for her. She's been called by God to found a new convent? How can this be? It's hard for us to capture what it must have been like for Theresa, but she really needed God's strength and prayer in order to do this. And as we'll see, this was the first step of almost another lifetime of work for her as a reformer and a founder. She liked to take her time in the kitchen too, and would be often heard saying things like, "The Lord is here among the pots and pans." And her task as superior was to teach these young women that the key to the religious life is humility, not ecstatic moments of prayer or locutions or tremendous gifts from God. No, these things may come, but God is the author of such realities. Our task is the daily, humble one of crafting our own soul in response to the promptings of His grace. This was the work that she rolled up her sleeves and was doing. But at that same time, God is doing more work in her soul. How He revealed His purposes to Theresa is again consoling to us. This is a woman who's hearing Christ speak to her. You might think that that's how the next chapter in her life would open, but no. God worked through human agency. He sent from Rome the superior general of the Carmelite order. Rome, you see, was the center of reform now, thanks to Charles Borromeo and now St. Pius V, thanks to Philip Neri and St. Ignatius Loyola. From Rome out to the rest of the church, good tidings of the gospel were coming. They came to Spain in the form of the superior general of the Carmelites who wanted to encourage reform, to help these monasteries be more true to their founding spirit. And he started in the south of the kingdom and worked his way north. By the time he got to Avila, he was almost dispirited. What he found was so much worldliness. Again, not positive evil, but just the religious life being lived out on the plane of nature, not the plane of grace. But he had perhaps heard of Theresa. He came to Avila and met her and saw that this is what he had in mind for reform. So he laid a burden on her. I need you to take this spirit of San Jose, this new Carmelite life, I need you to take it out to the rest of the kingdom of Castile. I need you to found monasteries. But my Lord, I must also have confessors. I cannot have holy nuns without confessors. Well then, here, I give you the authority with this writ to found 2 reformed male Carmelite convents. How can this be? A woman who's going to reform monks. And yet, this was God's plan. The next 15 years of St. Teresa's life are absolutely a whirlwind. She's traveling up and down across Spain, braving terrible weather. This is the moment in her life when she has that episode of falling into the creek. You may have heard about it. She says to the Lord in prayer, "Is this how you treat your friends? I see why you have so few of them." She was laboring in the vineyard, the result of which 17 reformed
Oh, goodness.
convents of Carmelite women, 11 reformed convents of Carmelite men, and at the time of her death, 500 men and women in Spain living under the strict, her as the prioress of the incarnation. Maybe she'll fix it up, maybe she'll die trying, but I'll solve both problems at once. The nuns at the incarnation in Avila, as you can imagine, they weren't real happy about this. They immediately fell back to their canonical rights. We are a properly constituted community. We have the right to elect our superior. You can't do this to us. Well, the provincial has the upper hand as far as canon law is concerned. So he marches down to the convent with Theresa, only to find the doors locked. When they finally get those doors opened, they're met with jeers and imprecations. The women are furious. They don't want to see Theresa. She's been gone for 10 years, and they haven't missed her. Well, she somehow does manage to sleep there that night, and what she does the next morning was really extraordinary. She called a chapter meeting, so all the nuns would come together into their chapter room. And when she came into the room, she did not go to the prioress's throne, but she went to the stall in the choir that she herself had used 10 years ago. She knelt down there silently and prayed to God for a moment, and then mysteriously rose up, left the chapter house, came back a few moments later from the chapel bearing a statue of Our Lady. She went forward and placed that statue of Our Lady on the throne of the prioress, and then said these words: "Your prioress, my ladies, is here. It is Our Lady of Mercy. As for me, I have come to you under obedience and in order to be your servant. I am a daughter of this house and your sister. Any one of you may teach and correct me. If I must give my blood and my life for you, I will do it willingly." Oh, our hearts melt in an appeal like this. How could any of these women have refused her their love? And yet most of them did that day. There was a little nucleus of nuns who were quite rightly moved by this speech, by this gesture, and they started to follow her and to pray with her and to listen to her. And slowly, with patience and grace, that number grew. She won them over. She had the help of another great saint, St. John of the Cross, who came to the incarnation and served as its confessor, living in a little hut just outside the walls and hearing those nuns' confessions. By the end of a year, the entire convent had been transformed. They were willingly giving away their private possessions, agreeing to be strictly cloistered during Lent and to observe more fasting and more hours of prayer. And at the end of her 3-year term as prioress, the nuns wanted her back. They wanted her to be re-elected and to stay. But she, of course, told them that no, God had other plans for her. She must be about them. And so she left the incarnation. But having given of her best there, what a great testimony to her forgiveness to these sisters who had so offended her, and to her wonderful love for God. The lesson of the life of Theresa of Avila is really quite simple. The true life that we lead is our life hidden with Christ in God. With her, we see that true reform comes forth from prayer. This is a woman who would gladly have stayed the rest of her life in St. Joseph's Convent with her beloved Christ. But when the church, in the person of the superior of the Carmelites, asks her to act, she does who has always looked at his wealth as belonging less to himself than to the poor, I thought that he would be able to bear this trial with equanimity. But then I look inside myself, she continues, and I see that I too have the same struggle. When our house in Seville came upon financial need, I was greatly troubled. And you see, she says to her brother, we never really know ourselves. And so there's only one solution, which is to flee from the all of this world to the all God. How comforting it is for us. St. Theresa of Avila in 1576, a mature, saintly woman, says, we never really know ourselves. She too is still going to confession. She's still asking God to heal her and to perfect her. She really is an approachable saint. And I'd like to conclude here with a couple of other specimens of her spiritual writing that show this same quality. Mental prayer, she said, in my opinion, is nothing else than an intimate sharing between friends. It means taking time frequently to be alone with Him, who we know loves us. If we are to enjoy the crucified, we must bear the cross, and there is no need to ask Him for that, for His Majesty treats those He loves as He treated His own Son. Such wisdom here, and wisdom that we can walk with and live with. She can be our old friend, speaking into our life and interceding for us. Saint Theresa of Avila, pray for us.
Okay. I wish they had gone a little bit more into her mystical experiences. They just kind of touch on them. Are any of you familiar with Bernini's beautiful sculpture, The Ecstasy of St. Teresa, where an angel is, piercing her heart, and it's almost erotic in its intensity, her spiritual ecstasy. Have you ever seen that painting? Yeah, it's really one of the most beautiful works, not just of Catholic art, but just sculpture, period. And that captures some of that kind of transcendent, mystical experience that she had. But it's quite a story. And I think I could be wrong about this, but I think she was the first female doctor of the church. I might have that wrong. I don't know who came first. But it's a remarkable story. And I put some biographical information in here. That video was a little longer than I thought it would be, so I just want to get to some of the questions that I had come up with. Unless anybody wants to offer anything before we do that? Oh, okay. There was some messed up stuff back in the old days, wasn't it? The church really needed a lot of reforming. Really? I mean, I guess in a historical way I could try to understand that because of finances and things, and I know, like where I used to live, I lived for a time in Connecticut, so the Diocese of Bridgeport encouraged priests, secular priests, meaning parish priests, to own property. They wanted you to buy property so that they wouldn't have to take care of you when you retired and get into like a priest's old age home. So it was like, well, okay, interesting. Oh, really? Oh, I bet. Right, the rules of the world were still applying. Yeah, it was the opposite of what it's supposed to be. Yeah, very sad. Well, Teresa tried to help with all that. And I really do love that story about if this is how you treat your friends, no wonder you have so few of them. Because I've often felt just personally, the more I've gotten closer, the more I've done more, the more I've studied more, like when I was trying to get a master's and all this and that, my life seemed to get harder, not better. That's always been a conundrum for me, why God works that way. I had a priest say, well, that's because God's trying to bring himself closer to you. And I'm like, that's like Teresa. I was like, well, that's a hell of a way to do it. Yes, Kathy? I don't know. I'd have to look that up. I'm sorry. I would have. I think these videos are wonderful, but they seem to touch upon things that I like. They need to be touching on other things. I don't. I just think that there was this great biography of hers that came out in the '90s, and I can't remember who wrote it, but it was a landmark biography, and she had all these mystical experiences, levitations and stuff. And I was just like, but it doesn't matter if we believe those or not ourselves. I think it's important to let me just get to, I guess, my favorite question that's in here. You can have an intellectual understanding of your faith, and you can also have, a semi-emotional or, this kind of connectivity. But it's really when you have a mystical experience that you. Oh, well, yes, there was always formation. Yeah. Just maybe not the way it was supposed to be. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Well, I believe that, but anybody too. Yeah, it's when I started going to mass every day that my wife left me, that I lost all my money, that everything bad happened in my life. Like the closer I was trying to get close to God, I was like, And I'm sorry I had to leave a moment ago. My mother is not well. She's in the hospital. She's 92. So I'm getting a lot of text messages. Plus, I was getting text messages from Father, asking me how this was going. So I apologize for leaving briefly. But this is a good one. Theresa was skeptical of some of her own mystical experiences, such as her levitations, and was careful to submit to her confessors. Yeah, well, I mean, or you may need to, see a psychiatrist. What does her caution reveal about the spiritual dangers involved in such experiences? Like, I mean, how do you? Yes, and maybe can you even believe it yourself? Like, could it be a form of madness? So I think it's very hard to talk about such matters. How do you describe a mystical experience? It's ineffable, meaning words don't do it justice. So how do you describe such a thing? But do you think there is a danger if you have these experiences in maybe talking too much about it? Exactly. Yeah, you're the vehicle. Yeah. That's another one I had. Um, okay. In Teresa discusses experiences that are difficult to articulate or ineffable. Right? How does she attempt to describe these experiences? Okay. Okay. It's very difficult to describe a mystical experience. Has anybody here ever had one? I have. I have, and I can't. I can try to talk about it. It was when my daughter was born, and being in the operating room, the delivery room, and I understood everything in like a 10-second flash. I understood the meaning of life. I understood my place in it. I could have been shot dead, and I would have been happy. Everything was beautiful. Everything was. I understood everything. I saw the face of God in my child. I can hold on to that, knowing that it was real, but it was brief. You just get like the door or the window opening ever so slightly. I don't know why. Perhaps to keep us going, perhaps to give us hope, perhaps to believe. I just know I had it. That's the best way I can to describe it. That's what made me start going back to Mass every day, to going to get a master's in theology, to doing all these different things. And then everything fell out. The more I got closer to God, the more I lost everything. I mean, and you know, I mean, I lost everything. I haven't lost my faith, thank God. But yes, and I'm tired of it because I'm failing the test. Often it's like one step forward, two steps back. Sometimes it's three steps forward, one step back, but it just doesn't stop. But then I realized if I can make any sense out of that, that is going to be the way it is for almost everybody until the day you die. You're never saved. You're never good. All bets are off until you die. But you said you had experience. Yeah, I was going to say you had said you had one.
Yeah, I was at a point where I was really low, and I was driving. My job right now has me sort of half the time here, half the time in DC. And I was driving down 81, going back to DC, and I said, and I just said, God, if you really love me, show me. And such a feeling of love came over me. At 80 miles an hour going north on 81, I do not recommend that. I almost went off the road. I was like, okay. But it was just, and there's been people in my family too. Like when my dad died, my mom had a big vision. And she had an aunt who was a Carmelite nun. And when she died, they heard a knock at the side door of the house, and nobody ever used the side door. And somebody went over and opened the side door and saw a vision of the little flower holding a funnel of roses. And then that was a big backbone for my aunt, who was a Carmelite nun, died.
That's a pretty powerful one. But I think they can come in little ways too. They don't always have to be. I mean, mine wasn't necessarily profound, but it can be less dramatic. It can be less, almost something that makes sense after the fact. Like seeing something beautiful, or you're having a lousy day and somebody is suddenly so super nice to you. That, like whether it's at work or at the store, it's God moving in these different ways to keep you going. What it did for Theresa, though, was far more than that. It's really remarkable what was happening during this 100-year period that most of these reformers were coming out of. Do you think that those convents needed reforming back then? It sounds like it. It yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot in Arizona. There's Franciscans, there's at least two Franciscan places in Arizona that I know of. There's a big Carmelite monastery in Wisconsin. Yeah, I get mail from them. I have them. You can fill out a thing and they'll pray with them for you. So they send me stuff all the time.
It's not many people are going into uh, women's religious orders. No, no. I have a cousin who was a sister of charity, but she left 30 years ago. Yeah, yeah. It's yeah. That's a whole other issue. It'd be a good discussion though. Discuss the difference, I like this one, between a lifetime of faith and a single radical conversion event. Because, you know, like I said, it's one thing to understand it prayerfully, which is quasi-mystical, and, you know, intellectually, you know, being schooled the right way, being a faithful Catholic. And why is it that certain people have these, like Theresa, like almost all the great saints had, they were all those things, but then they had this thing that was just even, you know, boom. Why? I've never been able to understand that. Why are certain people selected? Or are we all, is that open and available to all of us? Or is it just open to some? And sometimes the least likely people, you know, Peter, you know, not exactly Mr. Reliable. But it does seem, I mean, but she's not a least likely. She was already in a religious order. I mean, there's people like Dorothy Day, you know, was a former communist and radical, you know, turned out to be, hopefully she'll be sainted because she deserves it. You know, one of the two greatest American Catholics of the 20th century, you know. So I think God uses all different types of people that are literate, illiterate, educated, uneducated, and everybody in between. It almost feels like when he does this with certain people like Theresa of Avila, that they get almost extra super strength to carry on a specific mission that they've been guided to do, where she was creating new convent houses, creating new kinds of evangelization for people of her order, going to Rome. And it almost, it's as if this mystical experience imbues them with extra strength. Yes? That's a great point. How could you say no to it? It must be scary. Well, I would have been scared of her because she was, you know, too close to it. I would have been very nervous around her because I believed that she was, but it must be a little intimidating to know that someone has, you know, like my radio's got a lot of static tuning in God, and hers is coming in like FM, you know, back when FM was like, so, and it just always puzzles me, and why?
do, because he knew what you needed, and you could get that from him, and it would clarify your vision of what you needed to do in your life.
Or that, who was the great confessor? He was like considered a terrible student when he was becoming a priest. He was French. He was the great confessor. Everybody loved to go to, why can't I think of his name? Again, another unlikely person. Graduated like last in his class. Didn't know what to do with him. He turned out to be like the greatest confessor of all time. You know who I'm referring to? I just can't think of his name. I guess sometimes it also exposes hidden talents in people. It's just something to ponder. But I would urge all of you to just look up on if you have access to the internet. Look at that beautiful. Find a photograph of that Ecstasy of Saint Theresa by Bernini. It's a great thing to contemplate praying. Using it as a prayer aid. It's so beautiful. Anybody have anything they want to offer before we wrap this up? Please.
She also was during the period of Inquisition, and so she had a lot of her books, like I talked about, Francisco de Assis, Theresa of Avila, her was guiding her, and as she's watching the Inquisitioners throwing her books into the fire, she hears from God, I will make you a living book. She did write some.
You mean Theresa of Lisieux? Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty powerful. Well, yeah, she's pretty powerful. She also is a doctor. There's not too many women doctors in the church, sadly. And I don't know if Theresa of Avila was the first, but I think she was. I mean, she's a doctor of the church? No, she's not. I don't think she's interesting, though. She's a fascinating figure. Yes, sir. I think so. I mean, I think there's some that are very pronounced that, like, this was a very dramatic event. Yes, this was a very dramatic event, the one I had, but not as dramatic as, I've never heard God speaking to me, right? I think I would check myself into the hospital, perhaps, if that happened. But, I mean, I believe it's possible. But I think everybody does. I think mystical experiences are open to everybody, and I think they actually happen every day. Like when I was talking about just the little things, like an act of kindness, that can be like a mystical experience, especially if it comes out of the blue from a total stranger, or just, it doesn't have to be super grandiose, cinematic. Exactly. I believe that. And I think that people are afraid of acknowledging the supernatural because it has a connotation like a horror movie. The supernatural that's one of the other things I love about my Catholicism. I love the transcendent, that there's something more than this, that there's, it's what happens when you read a book. any book. You're having a transcendent experience just reading, or a beautiful piece of music that just transports you. Or, and these aren't unique to Catholicism itself, but the Catholic Church employs all the senses, especially during Mass, to help you get to that state, I think. And so, yes, I believe that people have mystical experiences every day without perhaps even realizing them. And they're also open and on offer to everyone. I just remember when I read that biography of hers in the 90s. This is when my child was born. I was getting really into all this stuff. And I remember I felt bad because I'm like, well, I don't levitate. I don't have all these other things. But then you shouldn't measure yourself up to, the greatest of saints. We're all saints in our own way, or have the ability to be. I'm not sure I put that perfectly well, but it goes back to that business where mystical experiences are happening, whether you realize it or not. But if you can attune yourself to it, you'll see that. If you can discern them, you'll have a happier day. So, do you want to say anything more? Did you folks want to wrap it up? Okay, I guess we can wrap it up. I'm sorry you came in late. I didn't give you one of these, so forgive me. And what is your name? I've seen you before.
I was here in the choir for a lot of years, and I've been gone for a lot of years, and now I'm...
Well, I'm glad you're back. I'm glad you came in here today. So the closing prayer is on the second to last page. And so we'll start with that. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. May today there be peace within. May you trust God that you are exactly where you are meant to be. May you not forget the infinite possibilities that are born in faith. May you use those gifts that you have received and pass on the love that has been given to you. May you be content knowing you are a child of God. Let this presence settle into your bones and allow your soul the freedom to sing, dance, praise, and love. It is there for each and every one of us. Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing frighten you. All things are passing away. God never changes. Patience obtains all things. Whoever has God lacks nothing. God alone suffices. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. That's a beautiful prayer. Isn't that? Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming. And George.